Looking for NFL football? Stop right here. You found your home for weekly NFL talk and fantasy football. Coming to you live from the BackupPunter.com. This is the Backup Punter Podcast. Now, here's your host, the man who thinks fullbacks win championships, Keegan Matheson.
Welcome to the show, the illegally batted ball. God damn it, we have another controversy in the NFL. And I think I'm at my limit. I can't find myself caring about this illegally batted ball in Seattle last night. I'm sure you all watched the game. Calvin Johnson of the Detroit Lions had a chance to put the Lions ahead on a pass from Matthew Stafford. If you're a Calvin Johnson fantasy owner, you definitely know about this. You probably didn't sleep last night. And just know that I'm here for you. The Backup Punter Podcast, we're here for you. As he stretched out the ball to put it over the goal line, Cam Chancellor, which we need to recognize this, Cam Chancellor with one of the best defensive plays you're going to see this season, knocks the ball out, and then KJ Wright bats it out the back of the end zone. And it's an illegally batted ball. Ball should have stayed with Detroit. And I'll tell you why I've stopped caring about this. There's two reasons. Number one is that it's getting to the point where you can't even expect the officials to understand this rule book anymore. When I watched the late game coverage last night, and I was up several hours after the game just watching ESPN, NFL Network, and as much crap as I give these analysts, especially the ex-players that read teleprompters that NFL Network rolls out, they are people around the game that have played the game, that understand the language of it, that understand the relationship between referees and players, etc. And listening to them even trying to have a conversation about this rule with Dean Blandino, with ex-referees, with Mike Pereira, just listening to them talk about it, it was confusing. And they were struggling to even wrap their head around it. And there was a lot of, so you mean it's this, and by that you mean this? Yeah. And that was all I really needed to see, quite frankly. If they can't understand it clearly, it's kind of like that Des Bryant catch rule, which is the Calvin Johnson rule already. If it's one of these rules that can't be explained simply, just by me talking to you, quickly explained, then something's wrong. The NFL rulebook is getting so convoluted and tangled and confusing with these rules that, yes, it is the referee's job to know it, to know that. But watching that play in real time, as fast as it's all happening, with the noise in the stadium, what's going on, can you expect them to? I don't know. And the second reason that I've given up caring about these controversies is, especially with this is not something defying a law of nature, a law of the world. It's not like I went out onto my balcony right now, held my hand over the ledge, and tried to drop something, but instead of going down to the earth, it shot up to the sky. That would be defying a law or a rule that would get me upset, that would confuse me. Football is a made-up game with made-up rules that we made up. It's not like these are laws, like don't kill somebody, don't steal money. It's a made-up rule that was written by somebody who thought it was a good idea and it wasn't written well enough. You hit the point where you say, I don't really care anymore. The Lions, should they have gotten the ball back? Maybe. But they also should have played better all game. And so should the Seahawks have. We'll talk about that a bit later. But anyways, this podcast, as always, it's brought to you by the very fine people at Dynasty Sports Empire Fantasy Sports. So check them out on dynastysportsempire.com or DSE_basketball and DSE_hockey. Hockey I almost said hockey kicks off in a couple of days. I guess we drop the puck in a couple of days here. Leafs Habs on the first night. I'll be excited watching that. I'm going to try to get back into hockey a little more this year. As a Canadian, I feel like I'm failing my nation by not following it as closely lately. And then DSE_basketball, like I said, get involved in a Dynasty Fantasy Startup Basketball League with dynastysportsempire.com. League start at $50. It is the creme de la creme of fantasy sports, so check them out. This podcast is one of the things not brought to you by DraftKings or FanDuel, unfortunately. By the sounds of it, it looks like the next court case is going to be brought to you by DraftKings, which, call it Schadenfreude, but I kind of love that. Get a little kick out of it. Now, before we get into the fantasy news today, of course, we're going to do what we always do here on the Backup Punter Podcast. We'll go through studs and duds, give you some sleepers. But this week I want to jump on a couple more general stories just out of the gate. Some things that I've noticed along the way. We're to the point in the season, 4 weeks in, 4 games for most teams. That early bye seems strange, doesn't it? Tennessee, New England not playing this week. Doesn't that seem a bit early in week 4? Anyways, we're at a point now where fantasy football-wise and real football-wise, which does still matter, we're at a point where things are leveling out a bit. You know what you have. And we've gotten to the point where guys like, say, Devonta Freeman have stepped up, and they're not just a flyer or a wild card anymore. They're kind of established. All the water is finding its level. And one thing that I noticed a little bit over the first few weeks, but it really just hit home yesterday watching the games and on Sunday watching the games, is that this has been a year of sloppy football. Period. And normally, you see that a lot on Thursday Night Football. You'll see another bad game this Thursday, I'm willing to bet, Houston versus Indianapolis. And Thursday Night Football, it breeds poor play every week. That's why I always recommend, if you can, grab a Thursday defense, because there's going to be interceptions and fumbles. But that is spilling into Sunday, into Monday Night Football. One of the reasons is poor offensive line play is something that I'm seeing as a widespread problem in the NFL right now. I'll use the Seahawks as an example, and I shouldn't because they won and they played an incredible defensive game, but they're an example of this. People forget that in that Jimmy Graham trade, they also lost a starting offensive lineman. Their offensive line has looked really poor. It's bottled up Marshawn Lynch. It's forced Russell Wilson to try to do the whole thing by himself, which he can do most times, but he's seeing a lot of pressure in the backfield. This is happening to a lot of teams, and it's really killing the run game. That's why you're seeing these star running backs. Look at Alfred Morris, look at DeMarco Murray. Speaking of bad offensive lines, Philadelphia is the king of it right now. They can't get a run game going. And there's a lot of these teams who are hoping that either scheme, like Philadelphia, or a great running back and quarterback, like Seattle, and there's many more, but these are the prime examples, hoping that scheme or a player will help to cover up for a poor offensive line. I'm of the opinion that offensive line is something you can't cover up for. You can use a great offensive line to cover up the running back. You can do that kind of in reverse, a little bit like Dallas is able to do. But you can't go the other way around. You can even get a decent quarterback passed and turn them into a good quarterback if you have a strong offensive line. But trying to cover up on offensive line does not work. Look at the Miami Dolphins. It's an embarrassing offensive line. It's horrible. Their starting guards shouldn't be on the roster, let alone starting. They wouldn't be on the roster of a lot of teams in this league. And it's making for bad football. Another reason that I think we're seeing a lot of bad football this year, not to mention the fact that kickers have missed, what's the number? I think it was 14 missed field goals. 14 it was. There's missed field goals all over the place this week. But another reason I think we're seeing football just looking a bit sloppy so far through 4 weeks is the shift in NFL culture, rules, practice regulations lately, how rarely these players get to involve themselves in a fully padded, a fully contact practice. So many players are held out of practice due to injury so often. You're not getting a lot of live game reps outside of live games. This has been the case for a couple of years now, but as you're seeing players enter their second, third, fourth year, where they're supposed to be stepping up as dynamic players, you're seeing drops, you're seeing fumbles, you're seeing missed assignments, and it's not like the NFL has regressed into this minor league for the CFL by any means. It's just that slight edge is missing this year because players are struggling to get reps outside of the live game. And I think we're going to see a bit more of this. But again, that offensive line play. And we don't talk about it enough because offensive lines do not produce fantasy points. sacks or interceptions, which are the only numbers that get you talked about in the NFL. But it is the heart of a team. It's the heart of an offense. And there is nowhere near enough offensive line talent in the NFL. There's not enough quarterback talent either, but there is not enough offensive line talent. There's just not. And this has produced some running back problems in the NFL. So let's touch on a couple of these as we get into some fantasy football talk. Running back problems. Number one, Washington Redskins. This is a place where I think the offensive line is okay there. This is kind of an issue of play calling, of trying to win matchups. Now, we have Thompson, the running back Thompson in Washington, who is really stealing the receiving role, something I thought would be a little more reserved for Matt Jones. He's putting up some big numbers. Then you have Matt Jones. Then you have Alfred Morris. Alfred Morris led the way this week. I think he had 19 carries, about 65 yards in that region. But you're running into a timeshare here, which is something that quite frankly, I don't like. And I'll tell you why. And it's not one of these things where I'm going to be a 1960s black and white bonehead and say you need one workhorse back to carry the football 50 times a game. Back when men were men, when you went out without a helmet and the beard was all you needed to protect your brain. I'm not trying to be an idiot here. I just think there's an actual advantage, a performance advantage to building up carries for running backs. And I think one place that we see this is in Philadelphia. Again, I'm harping on Philadelphia. I do love the Eagles, I promise. But we see this with DeMarco Murray. Now, he is complaining already, this far into a big contract, he's complaining that he's not getting the football enough. And he does have a point. Now, the obvious counterpoint to that is, try to be even halfway decent at your job. Try to be successful, and you might get the football a little bit more. That would be his best course of action here. But in Dallas, one of the reasons he was able to succeed was because he was fed the football, and fed the football some more. Now that he's in Philadelphia, they're abandoning the run very, very quickly, which kills an offense, which kills your fantasy team. And if you drafted DeMarco Murray high this year, you're screwed. It's killing you right now. And DeMarco Murray, he was a guy entering the season. I wasn't high on him by any means, but I'm not going to sit here like one of those assholes who say, "Oh, I knew all along. I was the first guy that was high on this guy." No, you weren't. Shut up. When you hear people saying that type of stuff, ignore them. "Oh, I've been high on Devonta Freeman since the offseason." "Oh man, I was high on Devonta Freeman when he was 4 years old." Don't listen to those people. And I'm not going to say I didn't predict this for DeMarco Murray. I thought he might have some injuries, maybe play 14 games is what I projected. But I thought he'd still have production, maybe the 10th or 12th or 14th top fantasy back. But this is bad. And a blueprint for what should be done was given to us by Jeff Fisher this week and his usage of Todd Gurley. Now, Todd Gurley is back, and he looks like he is himself, finally, which, thank God for his fantasy owners like me, who have been waiting for him. Todd Gurley coming back this week just allowed me to make a big trade in one of my primary leagues. I unloaded Arian Foster for Julio Jones, 1-for-1 in one of my leagues. And I'm pretty excited about that, and I was allowed to do that because because Todd Gurley is back. What the Rams did with Todd Gurley is they stayed committed to him. Now, part of this is because you need to be involved in the game. If your team goes down 20 points, you can't keep running. But when you're involved, you have to, and that's what Jeff Fisher did. Todd Gurley wasn't going anywhere in the first few quarters. He was getting 2 yards, losing 1, getting 3, getting 0, 1, 2. Nothing was happening. They stuck with the run, and in the fourth quarter, on just, I think, 9, 10, 11 carries, Todd Gurley had over 100 rushing yards. And that is why the St. Louis Rams beat the Arizona Cardinals. That's why they won the game, because he was allowed to build up carries. That's what needs to be done. You've heard me talk about this same thing with my frustrations regarding Frank Gore over the past couple of years. The San Francisco 49ers, you'd get to halftime, Frank Gore would have 11 carries for 35 yards, and they'd abandon it. They'd stop running. Frank Gore would end with 15 carries for 50 and look bad. But guys like Todd Gurley, like Gore, like DeMarco Murray, like Eddie Lacy, like Marshawn Lynch, like any of these guys that aren't just pure skill, pure electricity, these guys that do need it's not popular in the modern NFL where you want to protect everything, limit study your running backs. So it's difficult. It is difficult. So let's jump in to our fantasy football studs and duds for the week that was. We'll go through these quickly. Maybe we'll touch on the mess that's in Miami there right now. Maybe some good that can be taken out of the recent coaching change, Joe Philbin being fired by the Dolphins. And then we'll leave you with some fantasy sleepers. And at this time of the year, you kind of hit a point where we're moving away from fantasy sleepers and we're moving into fantasy streamers. You know, all of the Devonta Freemans, all of the big waiver ads are mostly gone by this time of year. There will be a couple injuries to come that will bring a guy up in an obvious situation. But at this time of year now, you're looking for guys to stream. You're looking for guys like an Eddie Royal. For example, an Eddie Royal. A guy who's just not spectacular, who kind of lives near the top of every waiver wire. You're not going to keep him all year, but just a guy to get you through a week. So to get started, Week 4 Fantasy Football Stud Team, the studs and duds. And you can find these each week on the backuppunter.com. Follow along on Twitter at the Backup Punter, on Facebook at the Backup Punter. And those are the places where you can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes or send in a question for the show each and every week. So to the stud team, quarterback Phillip Rivers is the QB1. Now, he had a couple down weeks to start the year, had his owners worried. Came back this week with 358 yards, 3 touchdowns. Antonio Gates is coming back this week. Melvin Gordon looks like he's improving. Things are going well for Phillip Rivers. I'm optimistic about him now. And they're going to be playing in some tight games. He'll be throwing the ball. RB1, Devonta Freeman. And like I said in the article on the site, this doesn't make sense. You're going to see people claiming they knew this was coming. They didn't. Devonta Freeman, through the first few games of this season, looked like a bad running back. He did. He had no burst. He wasn't finding holes. He lacked vision. He had another 3 touchdowns, 150 yards from scrimmage, involved on the ground and through the air. Now, we had a Twitter question this week from a friend of the show, Ryan Andrews, about Devonta Freeman, asking what type of split timeshare do I think that the Atlanta backfield will have when Tevin Coleman returns? Is Devonta Freeman going to be the lead dog? And I think that it's going to be almost a 70, it'll be a 70-30, a 75-25, but the most important thing is that Devonta Freeman has clearly earned any red zone touches, any goal line touches, because he's slamming those in really well behind an offensive line that looks improved. Maybe that's a relation. Maybe there's something to draw between that. Who knows? But Devonta Freeman, I think, will have the scoring opportunities. Tevin Coleman, maybe later in the game, between the 20s to get him into space. But Devonta Freeman, despite Tevin Coleman having some good draft capital spent on him, it's impossible to argue with this. If Devonta Freeman maybe had 80 yards and a touchdown the last couple weeks, then you say, oh, he's good, he's filling in, but these are stats that you get just because you're the starter. 150 yards, 3 touchdowns for his second consecutive week. He's got to be the lead dog until he screws up. So if he's on your roster, hold on to him tight. Or maybe sell high if you're a gambler. RB2 is Chris Ivory, one of my favorite players in this entire league on the Jets. 166 yards and a touchdown. The Jets do look good. Wide receiver 1. It's been a long time since I was this happy to give a player a spot on the stud team. That's Tavon Austin. It's great to see. Now, this former top 10 pick, he is electrifying, all the talent in the world, but, of course, he's one of these college speed threats that hasn't done a damn thing in the NFL. Until now, he looked very good, 96 yards receiving. I think it was 20 yards he got out of the backfield. In my opinion, Todd Gurley will be the best thing to ever happen to Tavon Austin. Ever. Now, I talk a lot about this, relationship between tight ends and running backs. Like, I've talked about how in Seattle they should have a good match with Jimmy Graham and Marshawn Lynch because If defenders come in to cover Lynch, then it's Graham over the top. If the safeties drop back to keep a cap on Jimmy Graham, then it's Marshawn Lynch up the middle. You get that back and forth. I think that the St. Louis Rams can get a similar thing going with Tavon Austin and Todd Gurley. You have Tavon Austin on the trick plays, on the end arounds, even straight runs out of the backfield I'd like to see. You also have him as a deep threat all over the field if you can get him the ball in space. He and Todd Gurley can take eyeballs off of each other back and forth, and if that's coached properly, there's real potential. Wide receiver 2 goes to Vincent Jackson, who is not dead yet. He caught 10 of 15 targets for 147 yards and a score. Jameis Winston looks horrible, but that doesn't matter because he's putting up counting stats. Allen Hurns comes in as wide receiver 3. He's the number 2 wide receiver in Jacksonville behind Allen Robinson, but he's getting a ton of looks, and he's converting on a very high number of his targets. Maybe that's not sustainable, but he's making it happen. He topped 100 yards with a touchdown there. Tight end 1 on the stud team. Here was an unexpected one, but I gave it to Coby Fleener. Now, he was some people streamed him this week without Rob Gronkowski, perhaps, but he didn't have Andrew Luck. He had Matt Hasselbeck. Didn't matter. Scored a touchdown, put up some good points, but honorable mention to Gary Barnidge, who we'll talk about later. And then the defense stud was the Atlanta Falcons. They are playing fast as hell, playing much better under their new coach. They got 2 defensive touchdowns. They have completely turned it around. Vic Beasley is a big reason for that, and an improved secondary is a big reason for that. Not many people streamed the Falcons this week, but they were a very, very good play. Now on to the dud team, a guy who I feel like I harp on too much, but he's given me reasons to. Peyton Manning. He had another bad week this week. 2 interceptions, didn't put up the yardage or touchdown totals. I think he's going to be a fine quarterback for his team. He's going to get his team where they need to be, and Denver's defense is awesome this year. But for fantasy purposes, Peyton Manning, I don't see it. RB1, DeMarco Murray, we talked enough about him. RB2 on the dud team is Carlos Hyde. Just 20 rushing yards for Carlos Hyde against the Green Bay Packers, who have looked better lately, but they're not a good rushing defense. They're really not. And his comments after the game, Carlos Hyde's comments, were that the box was loaded. The Packers were putting 8 men in the box. Well, A, too bad for you. B, that's what you have to overcome. Your quarterback is Colin Kaepernick. Nobody in this league is going to take Colin Kaepernick seriously as a passer until he completely turns this season around. So Carlos Hyde is going to have to find some other ways to get through that line. That offensive line is going to really need to pick it up. They're going to need to get some blocking tight ends, some fullbacks involved, something, because the offense is not working in San Francisco right now. On to the wide receivers. There's some real talent on the dud team wide receivers, as there always is. Julio Jones, wide receiver 1, with just 38 yards. Again, with Devonta Freeman scoring 3 touchdowns. The scoring went where it doesn't usually, so that's okay. Jones will be back. Wide receiver 2, Odell Beckham. He just had 38 yards himself, so same as Julio Jones, he'll be back. And then wide receiver 3 I included is Brandon Cooks of the New Orleans Saints. He was drafted high this year, and there were a lot of people, almost more than any receiver. Cooks had people who were really high on him. He was a guy who you were a big believer if you believed in Brandon Cooks. Hasn't happened. I thought Drew Brees coming back would ignite him. Hasn't happened. Tight end 1 on the dud team, Travis Kelce making a rare appearance. He had 49 yards, which is an okay day, but he fumbled a ball. So that cut him down to 2.9 points in most standard scoring leagues. Disappointing day, but of course he's going to be a top 3 tight end probably for the year. Top 4 at least. Keep rolling him. And then the dud defense, another surprise, the Arizona Cardinals against the St. Louis Rams there, where Todd Gurley ran wild. The Cardinals, keep rolling them out. They're a great defense. They just didn't get any of the statistics you need. They weren't putting up interceptions, sacks, anything like that this week. So they were a disappointment, the Arizona Cardinals were. So that's the stud and dud team. I'm not sure if you can hear the noise in the background. It sounds like they're jackhammering my building out of the ground. So this might be the last podcast. Might be the last episode you hear. If it is, it's been a pleasure. Now let's get on to that news out of Miami just quickly before we get you with some sleepers and get you off for your day. Now the Miami Dolphins got rid of Coach Joe Philbin. First point to make on this is the fact that Joe Philbin is probably one of the better human beings in the NFL. There was a huge outpouring of support from his former Packers players when he was a coach with the Packers. He is a good guy by every account possible. Now, I know this is the NFL, so that doesn't matter at all. It's probably used as a negative against him in the NFL. But it's a point that needs to be made. He really is. He's a great person. Now, he's been replaced. I don't know if much is going to change in Miami. They might be going for a big splash head coach next offseason. But things haven't been right. Jarvis Landry looks like their only weapon. Now, I said last week to give Devontae Parker a speculative addition to your team. He didn't show up this week. Kenny Stills, that's a guy to keep an eye on. He looked much better. He looked like he gave a damn this week, which put him head and shoulders above the rest of the roster. The report came out this week that Ryan Tannehill is a bit of a dick, which, whatever. The report out of Miami said that he was being picked off in practice, and it was really getting to him. And he was telling the practice squad players, hell, enjoy your practice squad paycheck. Oh, here's your practice squad trophy. Just kind of a spoiled kid, and it doesn't matter. That's a story that's going to get overblown, but it just makes me not like the guy, really. That's about it. And Ndamukong Suh isn't doing himself any favors there either. He was paid pretty much all the money in the world, approximately all the money in the world, to sign with Miami as a free agent. He's not doing anything. He's not getting to the quarterback. He's not pressuring the quarterback. And he doesn't look like he particularly cares. Another lesson on the fact that winning free agency doesn't mean anything. In fact, if you come away with the biggest free agent signing, I'm almost more inclined to say that you will be a loser because of that. There's no such thing as value for top-end free agents. If you're paying someone $20 million on the open market, you're not going to get value. Unless it's a quarterback, you're just not. And even then, probably won't. Now, Lamar Miller is the one player that I guess I care about in Miami. And that sounds harsh, but he's the one where I really think his season is still salvageable, or I think he's really playing below the potential he does have, which is immense. He rushed for over 1,000 yards last year. Over 5 yards per carry. This guy is talented. But, like we talked about earlier, they are abandoning the run so quickly and so frequently. And they have no offensive line. Lamar Miller's not a guy that can make something out of nothing. He's not Marshawn Lynch. He needs to be given a hole for a few yards, and then maybe he'll take it for 95. But if he doesn't see any yards, he's not going to grind 3 or 4 out of it. So I'm hopeful that Lamar Miller will be sparked by this coaching change. I'd like to see them get the ball to him in space a little bit more often in the receiving game, maybe the screen game. He's talented. He can help Ryan Tannehill a lot. So hopefully that turns around in Miami, because right now this season just looks like a waste of money, quite frankly. And you're seeing the same thing to some extent down in Houston. I'll touch on this quick. With J.J. Watt, and let me clarify this by all means. J.J. Watt is top 3 player in the NFL, top defensive player of his generation, and he is someone who cares. So that puts him above Ndamukong Suh. But it's one of these things where it's a contract to a defensive lineman and an elite one, and he's performing like an elite one, but it's being wasted in Houston. Ryan Mallett does not look good. He's going to start again this Thursday. Not sure why. Brian Hoyer still on the bench. He's not a great option himself. Arian Foster's back, so they'll at least have a chance. But I just look at a team like Houston, and if Houston does not make a serious play for either the top quarterback in the draft this year or a top quarterback available through trade or free agency, if they don't address it in a big way this offseason, and you're a fan of the Texans, what the hell are you supposed to think? You're wasting J.J. Watt with a carousel of Ryan Fitzpatrick, Brian Hoyer, Ryan Mallett, stuff like this. That doesn't work. That's not okay. So, maybe, I don't know. Why do I see Jay Cutler in Houston next year? I can almost picture it, but we'll see. Now let's get you on to some sleepers and streamers before you get on your merry way this fine Tuesday, this waiver wire Tuesday. And like I said, right now it's not really about getting that dominant sleeper. We're getting into bye weeks, so if you've got a quarterback bye week, here's a few to consider. Some better than others. Alex Smith playing for the Kansas City Chiefs against the Chicago Bears. He's a guy that I'd consider. He's put up a couple decent weeks. He might be a good bet just to get you those 20, 22 points and get you on your way. Jeremy Maclin is really helping him out now that they've started to use him, which is wise. He's playing the Bears. They're not a great opponent. So if you just need to get by, he's a good one. Sam Bradford. He might have been dropped in some of your leagues. He might get dropped today in some of your leagues. He's playing the New Orleans Saints, who are not a great matchup against a quarterback. They allow some yards. Sam Bradford did connect on some deep balls this past week. Now, that means there's a thin margin for error here. If he misses those, then he has a dud week. If he makes one more, then he has a massive week. What's he going to do this week? I think he's going to bounce back. And he has the potential to give you a big week. Potential for a dud, but if you need a big one, maybe this is the time to buy low on Sam Bradford. You never know. And then if you're really desperate, Jameis Winston's playing the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, he put up 4 interceptions last week, looked real bad, but he still managed almost 20 points. So the counting stats are going to be there, and he's going to be throwing that ball around pretty often. Now, looking at running back, if Darren McFadden isn't rostered in your league, this might be a good time to stash him on the bench. Lance Dunbar is done for the year, knee injury, which is a big hit because he was getting a lot of receptions out of the backfield. Maybe Darren McFadden can take some of those, cut into Joseph Randall's workload a bit. He's got to be on a roster. If Ronnie Hillman isn't on a roster in your league, he must be. It looks like he's going to run ahead of C.J. Anderson this week. He's a must roster. He probably already is in your league, though. Thomas Rawls of the Seattle Seahawks didn't do much last night. Not really his fault. And he wasn't always asked to do too much. Russell Wilson really took that game on his shoulders for much of it. But Fred Jackson, injured last night. Marshawn Lynch, I don't know if he'll start next week. Is he going to be at 100%? Thomas Rawls should be a roster stash in most standard formats. And then of the Cleveland Browns, Duke Johnson. I was kind of high on him entering the year. Then I dropped off. I actually had him in a league with very big rosters, and I dropped him because I could afford to, and he wasn't doing anything for me. This past week, 9 receptions for 85 yards and a touchdown. Josh McCown is figuring out how to use him. So you got to roster Duke Johnson if he's not in your league right now, because if they use him as that receiving back, kind of like Lance Dunbar was in Dallas for a bit, he's got some great value. Then to wide receiver, we talked about Tavon Austin. I'd give him a very speculative look. Willie Snead in New Orleans. He is playing ahead of Brandon Coleman now as the third receiver. And given how limited Marquez Colston is, that kind of makes him receiver 2B. It's not a guy that I'd start this week. I want to see what Drew Brees does with him for one more week. But if he can be the second or third target in that offense in terms of wide receivers, he might be that wide receiver 3 or 4 just to grind you through a bye week over the next month. Kamar Aiken of the Baltimore Ravens. Don't love the player, but I love the situation. If Steve Smith is forced to miss time, or if he returns and is limited, Kamar Aiken will be the first wide receiver up for targets from Joe Flacco. Eddie Royal, like I mentioned earlier, of the Chicago Bears, he put up 7 receptions, 54 yards, and a touchdown this week. Jay Cutler's back. Eddie Royal is his best friend on that offense. Alshon Jeffrey's the most talented, but Cutler loves looking for Eddie Royal. And these are the weeks he's going to give you. If the touchdown isn't there, you might just get that 4, 5, 6 week thing, but it's good to look at him. And then Nelson Aguilar of the Philadelphia Eagles. This guy was drafted in the mid-rounds of a lot of drafts. I think in a couple of my leagues, he was as high as 5, 6, 7 in those rounds, and which, at the time, it made sense. We've seen what rookie receivers do over the past couple of years. He started out slow. I have a feeling that Nelson Aguilar is about to take off. Not into an Odell Beckham or anything like that, but I think he's about to click and become very fantasy relevant. Looking at tight ends, if you need a tight end this week, can't believe I'm saying it, but take a look at Gary Barnidge of the Cleveland Browns. This is a guy breaking out at age 30 after a career of doing not much. 6 receptions, 75 yards, and a touchdown last week. He might need a touchdown to be fantasy relevant for you, but who the hell else is going to catch a football in Cleveland outside of him And outside of Duke Johnson, well, Travis Benjamin he might catch one ball a game for 110 yards, which is fantastic. But Gary Barnidge is going to get a lot of looks, and Josh McCown looks like he's pretty entrenched there now, which is good. You could also look for Owen Daniels of the Denver Broncos, who Peyton Manning loves to throw the ball to. Touchdowns in his last 2 games. He's not a guy that's going to put up 100 yards, but he's playing Oakland this week. Oakland are very, very poor against opposing tight ends. So if they can get into the red zone, which they're going to, he will be a great option. And then Richard Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers. Arguably the best Rodgers on the Packers, if I say so myself. He put up 5 receptions for 45 yards and a touchdown this week, especially with Devontae Adams out. James Jones and Randall Cobb will be seeing a lot of coverage in the red zone. And Eddie Lacy still isn't running at 100%. Half because the Packers don't like to do that early, and half because he's banged up. Richard Rodgers is going to see some red zone targets. What he does with them, not quite sure. But this is a week where he's going to be targeted more than usual, focused on more than usual, and have a higher than average potential. So it's something to look at. Then in terms of defense, a real deep sleeper you might want to look at is the New York Giants versus the San Francisco 49ers. The Giants held Tyrod Taylor in check this week. Tyrod Taylor and Colin Kaepernick are kind of similar. They're not opposites by any means, both mobile quarterbacks. So check out the Giants. They're probably not owned in your league. And if you really want to target a game, Tampa Bay Buccaneers versus Jacksonville Jaguars. Obviously, that is the least appealing game to watch in in your wildest imagination. Pick one game that you don't want to watch. It's probably Bucs versus Jaguars. There are going to be fumbles, there will be interceptions, and there will be bad football, but that means good defensive points. If I had to choose, I think I would take the Jaguars because Jameis Winston gives that turnover potential. And while Doug Martin had a breakout week this week, he's kind of just plodding along. So I'd probably take the Jaguars of those two, but I don't think you can go wrong with either. They both have potential to give you those double-digit points there. Man, what a game that is going to be. I might have to watch it just out of spite. How terrible is that? So again, thank you for joining the podcast. This is the Backup Punter Podcast, which I hope you already knew if you've listened to 37 minutes of it. You can subscribe on iTunes or on Stitcher if you're an Android user. I also put the podcast up on YouTube. Now, I'm not sure if that'll continue or not. It will, at least until further notice. It's quite the production, quite the audio production to get it up on YouTube. But if you do enjoy listening to it there, give me a shout out on Twitter at the Backup Punter. Let me know you're listening there, and as long as a few people are, I'll keep it going. That's for sure. So you can check out new content throughout the week at thebackupunter.com, including game picks on Thursday. I did very good last week, week 3. This week, I haven't looked over the list just yet. I think I did all right. Kind of saving myself after a week 2 that almost had me just shutting down the website and burning the podcast. But we're getting back on our feet here at the Backup Punter Podcast, and I thank you for tuning in each and every week. So reach out over Twitter, email at thebackupunter@gmail.com, any questions you might have, and we'll be back with you next Tuesday morning. This is Keegan Matheson, hoping that all of your punts in life stop on the 1-yard line. We'll talk next week.